Hello, I'm Martin Giannini, Executive Director of Red Bull Theater here in New York City. I am zooming to you from our offices in Chelsea on the island of Manhattan, the unceded ancestral home of the Lenape people. I want to welcome you to this exciting seminar on Edward Young's The Revenge, as part of Red Bull Theater's Revelation reading series, sponsored and presented in partnership with the Mellon Foundation, sponsored On Decolonizing Theater seminar at Northwestern University and the R18 Collective. We hope you'll join us for our reading of The Revenge, starring John Douglas Thompson and Matthew Rauch, and directed by our Associate Artistic Director, Nathan Winkelstein, this coming Monday at the Peter J. Sharp Theater at 416 West 42nd Street in New York, or from your living room and across the country watching our live stream. You can get tickets at redbulltheater.com. I am pleased now to welcome Tracy C. Davis, a Barber Professor of Performing Arts at Northwestern University and one of the driving forces behind this project, who will be moderating tonight's conversation. Hello, Tracy.
Hi, Martin. Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody at Red Bull who's made this possible.
Wonderful. I look forward to listening in.
So I want to start with just a brief prefatory remark about why think about The Revenge, why this play, and why now. And this was sparked in part by the readings that the R18 Collective did together in our own studies, thinking about what kinds of plays would be stageable in the 21st century that speak to concerns that we have now that are pressing upon our culture. And in the fall of 2022, Lisa Freeman sponsored a wonderful event at the Newberry Library with the University of Illinois at Chicago, in conjunction with Congo Square Theater, where we saw some of these scenes in readings. We heard them and thought all the more emphatically how terrific the dialogues are and how terrific the monologues are as well. So I'm hoping that we can tantalize our listeners to follow up and read the play, as well as tune in or visit in person the production next week with Red Bull. The potential for connecting to pressing issues of decolonization are manifest in this play, from thinking about racialized memory, multi-generational trauma, and the fascinating cross-cultural and multicultural bicontinental context of this revenge story. I'm delighted to be able to introduce and welcome 4 wonderful panelists, and we'll just briefly welcome them one at a time to the screen and then hear their presentations in this order. First, Cornesha Tweede. Welcome, Cornesha. Cornesha is Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Arizona State University. Our second presenter is Lisa A. Freeman, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of English at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Our third speaker will be Amy Huang, Assistant Professor of Theater and Performance Studies at Bates College. And our final speaker is Bridget Orr, Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. Welcome, everyone. If the live listeners, have any pressing questions, feel free to type them into the comments section, and we might be able to take those up following each presenter. Otherwise, we look forward to a robust and extended conversation stimulated by questions from the audience after we hear Bridget's talk. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Cornesha.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity and to come and speak with you guys a little bit. Yes. So good evening. I'm here to talk a little bit about, with regards to this particular play, the setting. And so I'm really excited to talk with you guys today. Young implicitly taps into the play's setting within early modern Iberian history through the figure of Zanga and his actions. And I would also add here his words. Zanga is a prince and a person of the Islamic faith. The play conveys Zanga as the North African abject to the European subject. Zanga seeks revenge on Don Alonso, the Spanish general who had captured him and murdered his father. Zanga's actions and words center the play's setting more on geopolitical issues and avenging his father's and his country's wrongs at the hands of Spain. This furthers the revenge Zanga desires. For over 700 years prior to 1492, Iberia was occupied by Islamic rulers who established kingdoms, caliphates with capitals in Cordoba and Granada. Christian Spain, or the joint crowns of Castilla y Aragon, was a new formation imposed by the Catholic kings Isabella and Ferdinand after they conquered Granada in 1492. It has been argued that a combination of cultural, linguistic, religious, and ethnic insecurity arose from attempts to forge on the peninsula what we would call now a nation, a unified political and cultural area situated in a contiguous geographic space. Part of this project entails establishing a narrative of permanence, of teleological development toward the accomplished form of geographic, political, and ethical unity achieved in 1492. So part of this mission involved casting 700 years of multicultural, multi-ethnic history as an Islamic occupation of Spain, a temporary interruption of eternal Christian Spanishness. And so Al-Andalus, which ranges from 711 to 1492, was the name of the Iberian Peninsula during these years. The name is the rule of people of the Islamic faith. More specifically, it describes the states that ruled the Iberia, including Arab and North African states. In the early part of the 15th century, Spain colonized the Canaries while the Portuguese colonized Ceuta in North Africa and the occupation of the Madeira and Azores archipelagos. These empires were influential from the 1500s to the mid-1600s. The Iberian Union was solidified through the dynastic union of the two kingdoms under the Spanish crown from 1580 to 1640. During this period, all the overseas possessions of the Portuguese crown came under the rule of Spanish Habsburg kings, Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV. So when we think about this going on in this time frame, we think about race constructions. So as we think about race constructions within the medieval and early modern Mediterranean, it often describes a racialization of several groups: white Christian Europeans, people of the Hebrew faith, people of the Islamic faith, and Black Africans. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, sought to erase, dispose, and conquer the Black elements within the peninsula during the late medieval and early modern eras. Ironically, early modern Iberia wanted to eliminate any, quote, tainted person, end quote, concerning religion and blood purity practices. Their way of claiming subjectivity from being, quote, the other, end quote, to Christian Europe was the forced conversion to Catholicism among people of Hebrew and Islamic faiths and enslaved Black Africans forcefully. So we see that there's a conflation between people of the Hebrew faith, people of the Islamic faith, and Black Africans that represent the Blackness on the Iberian Peninsula. In particular, I want to lead us to a particular part, a dialogue in between Zanga and Alonso in the 5th act, scene 2, the Bower, the Bower, because this really helps us to understand the setting and the racialization between Spain and North Africa and how it's contextualized through Zanga's words, as well as what Alonso responds. And I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to read a bit, but it begins. Zanga says, "Why this is well, why this blow is for blow. Where are you? Crown me, shadow me with laurels, ye spirits which delight in just revenge. Let Europe and her pallid sons go weep. Let Afrique and her 100 thrones rejoice. Oh, my dear countrymen, I look down and see how I bestride your prostrate conqueror. I tread on haughty Spain and all her kings, but this is mercy. This is my indulgence." And I won't continue, but I'll go on to how Alonso responds immediately and says, "Inhuman slave." Zanga responds, "Fallen Christian, thou mistakest my character. Look on me. Who am I? I know thou sayest, the Moor, a slave, an abject, beaten slave." And I'll end it there. As I continue, I use the term racialization rather than race, as race is not the same in the 21st century in the US as in the 15th and 16th centuries on the Iberian Peninsula. Racialization refers to the process of fusing the various kinds of otherness and sameness dominant groups established by religion, ethnicity, language, and incipiently skin tone during the 16th and 17th centuries. Race as a term emerges principally in the 18th and 19th centuries, and racialization would eventually turn into a starker race discourse that promoted and contributed to a white hegemonic European tradition. The conflation of people of Hebrew faith, people of Islamic faith, and Black Africans represent the Blackness of the Iberian Peninsula from a hegemonic European, often Northern and non-Iberian perspective. Huang uses these actions and words and the characterization of Zanga in particular to contextualize Iberian history. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cornesha.
All right,
Lisa,
I'll pick
you're
up
up.
there and just say good evening to everyone, and thank you to Tracy and Red Bull for organizing this impressive webinar panel on Edward Young's The Revenge. I'm really delighted to find myself in such good company, and equally excited to see Red Bull's Revelation series reading of The Revenge next Monday. To see this work picked up for Red Bull Revelations reading is absolutely thrilling. Tracy referred earlier to our R18 symposium, fall 2022. So it's really wonderful to see this. And of course, we hope that that reading next week will lead to a full-scale production, as this play, as Cornesha has already shared with us, it has a lot to say about our contemporary moment, even as it illustrates and arguably troubles much of our received knowledge about the representation of race and the status of slavery in the 18th and early 19th centuries. To borrow a phrase made popular by the Romantic poets of this period, one of the great challenges of staging The Revenge today lies in how best to estrange the familiar and familiarize the strange. Part of the strangeness, so I'm going to talk a little bit about genre, and then I'll talk about how the productions evolved a little bit at the end. Part of the strangeness of The Revenge for us derives from the fact that it draws on the conventions of two major tragic genres of variable familiarity to contemporary audiences, and whose impulses arguably run in opposite directions. First, there is the genre from which Young's play takes its title, the revenge tragedy, a popular early modern genre which many contemporary audiences are likely to be quite familiar with from the stagings of plays such as Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi, and of course, the most widely known and most frequently produced of all revenge tragedies, Shakespeare's Hamlet. The second genre concerned here is heroic drama, also known as heroic tragedy, which is a genre much less familiar to contemporary audiences, and one whose conventions are likely not only to be off-putting, but also confounding to 21st century audiences. Written in high-flown verse filled with turgid hyperbole and extravagant metaphors, and featuring plots that focus on conflicts between love and honor and on competing loyalties between male friendship and heterosexual love, heroic drama emerged as a dominant popular form in the Restoration period, exemplified by John Dryden's All for Love. Where revenge tragedies are typically characterized by a focus on action and on their protagonist's single-minded drive to achieve their vengeful ends, heroic dramas, by contrast, are often dominated by dilatory, declamatory scenes in which, for all practical purposes, the action is brought to a standstill, and indeed all thought of action virtually suspended, while the protagonists luxuriate in extravagant expressions of their internal conflicts and affective anguish. In approaching the revenge as a revenge tragedy embedded in a heroic drama, contemporary directors and actors have a number of significant dilemmas. With its overblown rhetoric and coercive metaphors, heroic drama is designed to derange our sense of proportion. Hence, the expression of high-flying passions that dominate the scene of action in The Revenge often distract us from the more material and consequential action of imperial conquest, especially and perhaps paradoxically, because the vexed lovers who are Zanga's target for revenge often employ metaphors of conquest that are conventionally compelling. Placing too much emphasis on the heroic creates the deranging risk of our experiencing the conquest of the entire continent of Africa and its peoples as nothing in comparison to the ill-fated passions and jealousies of three European individuals. In that sense, the death of these lovers can be experienced as a greater tragedy than the geopolitical materiality of the reported death of quote-unquote twice 10,000 slain Moors. But if we strip away the heroic from the play too much, and this is where I think the quandaries really start to enter, we risk losing a sense of precisely what distinguishes Xanga from other protagonists and what we can learn from the status of slavery and the representation of race during the period in which the play was popular on the boards. Indeed, it is the heroic which allows us to view Xanga as elevated and ennobled, and his vengeful quest as grounded in honor, and as a result, to understand both how electrifying and compelling this Black figure was on the stage and page both then, and I hope now. Indeed, the brilliant early 19th century critic Elizabeth Inchbald was so impressed and disturbed as to write of Young's Xanga, quote, "In one of his characters, he has surpassed the genius of Shakespeare, but immorally so. He has adorned malice and its kindred vices with sentiment appropriate to the rarest virtue, scrupulous regard for unblemished honor. The high-sounding vengeance of Xanga charms every heart," unquote. Only in this context, in other words, can the one arbitrary blow administered by Xanga's master Alonso, rather than either the defeat and death of his father in battle, or even enslavement itself, be understood as a singular violation of honor, which to quote unquote Moorish tempers, as the dramatic censor wrote admiringly in 1770, proves an offense never to be forgiven. In my current research, I've been examining any number of editions of The Revenge, including a Covent Garden prompt book from the early 19th century, to track how almost from its very first performance, the tragedy was deeply cut and adapted for representation on the stage, and to determine whether there are any patterns of meaning to be discerned with respect to the questions and issues I've just raised. My research is at too early a stage to draw any major conclusions, but it is clear, at least, that in cutting the play, both to ensure shorter run times and to accommodate the acting style, strengths, and weaknesses of a succession of star actors, the Playhouse managers were also trying to find the right balance between heroic bombast and the streamlined action of revenge, between elevating the extravagant displays of the passions and preparing the ground for the moment when Xanga comes fully into his own, to reveal his masterful manipulation of the action and to declare, in one of the more stunning and powerful points on the 18th and 19th century stage, "'Twas I." It is also clear from theater reviews, however, that as the dehumanizing practices of abjection that governed the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery came to eclipse any earlier concept of martial enslavement, more and more of the heroic was stripped from the play, and that streamlining also diminished Xanga's standing as a heroic figure of honor. Thus, where the dramatic censor wrote in 1770, when James Quinn held the stage, that, quote, "Xanga is a finished villain with some greatness of mind," unquote, William Hazlitt wrote of Edmund Kean's Xanga in 1815, quote, "The giving the dark, treacherous, fierce, and remorseless character to the Moor is an alteration which is more in conformity to our prejudices as well as to historical truth. He had the wild impetuosity of barbarous revenge, the glowing energy of the untamed children of the sun, whose blood drinks up the radiance of fiercer skies," end quote. While Hazlitt's claims to historical truth here are deeply problematic, we could talk about it for hours, especially when they are made in despite of his own acknowledgement of prejudices, they can also be read along with the attribution of animalistic qualities to Xanga just moments later in the same essay as an indice of how the perception of race had changed over time. This is what I think Cornesha is also getting at, and the remorseless character of the more construed. I look forward to our discussion this evening and then to seeing what the Red Bull team decides to do with the script and what choices are made by its director and actors as they seek to negotiate the fraught tensions embedded in the original between revenge tragedy and heroic drama, and to lay claim to a historical truth that might instead preserve the greatness of Xanga's mind.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And I know that both Amy and Bridget are going to take up some of those themes and thinking more about interpretation over time. Amy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. And thank you so much to Tracy Davis and to everyone at Red Bull for inviting me on this wonderful panel. I think Lisa's work has actually spurred most of my work, so it's really great to be here. So in multiple places in Edward Young's The Revenge, Zenga refers to his plan for revenge as a masterwork or a masterpiece. Vengeance, he suggests, is a work of art, and Zenga, the relentless avenger, is a consummate artist. This role, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think Lisa was mentioning this, was a vehicle for the display of virtuosic acting and also for fine elocution. So a lot of Zenga's lines do appear in elocution manuals, for example. So today we might think of Shakespeare's soliloquizing Hamlet as an icon of eloquent introspection. Yet Zenga's many soliloquies and asides, I've argued, also lay claim to a rich interior life for this racialized character. And this introspection, which is aligned with Kevin Quashie's idea of the sovereignty of quiet, is deeply resonant in a variety of portrayals of Zenga across transatlantic stages. Zenga often inwardly holds on to resentment, even as he outwardly performs this great homosocial friendship to Don Alonso. And this type of rich interiority and reflectiveness greatly challenges much of the scientific racism that's rife in the early Republic and antebellum period. So I know Lisa was tracing some of the newspapers and periodicals that were reviewing The Revenge. For example, the Irish Shield, which is talking about New York productions of The Revenge in the early antebellum period, mentioned that it's impossible to have this Moorish portrayal, this Moorish character actually be this reflective character, right? Because it goes against what Hume and Buffon are arguing, that these Moorish people are actually incapable of this kind of reflective interiority and thought process. In addition, we can also think too of Thomas Jefferson, right, and his idea that there's that Black people have a transient grief, right? And this is an immovable veil of black. Zenga proves a lie to this, and it really challenges this kind of scientific racism because he's so incredibly reflective. So this is a huge difference and a kind of a break from other Moorish characters we've seen. For example, Othello, right? I think Miles Greer's new work on Inkface is really, really great in thinking about tracing Othello as someone who is constantly being read, but is also unable to read things, right? Zenga is an excellent reader. And also, there's a difference here, I think, with the ink face or the black face that Othello is representing. Othello's blackface, Greer points out, is also a kind of a stigma that highlights miscegenation, right? It can rub off on a white actress, Desdemona. Here, Zenga never really touches, right? There's not really a threat of miscegenation with Leonora. Instead, I would argue that what's contagious here is not miscegenation, it's actually morality and immorality, that actually the audience is being infected by immorality, right? Re-identifying away from strictures of morality and actually identifying with Zenga's immorality, right? As Lisa was pointing out, this heroic tragedy is taking this idea of vengeance and making it actually honorable. So it's a kind of an infectious immorality that's being unleashed into the audience. It's very dangerous for particularly an early American audience. As well, I was pointing out that Othello is this really gullible character. Zenga is not. So if we look at Act 3, for example, Zenga actually forges a letter that supposedly has proof of Leonora's infidelity. And Isabella says, if Alonso read it, it can't sting him, right? And Zenga actually says, at first I thought so, but farther thought informs me otherwise. He shall more credit because unseen, right? He's actually reading that situation, reading the character. Later on, he performs reading that letter, right? So he's really an excellent reader of situations, whereas earlier blackface characters are very much gullible and illiterate in many ways. Here he performs literacy to the nth degree. He's a very, very, very good reader of situations. So I wanted to also think too about the way that the play starts. This is one place in which it's incredibly clear that the play is very interested in introspection. It starts with a soliloquy. So in the beginning, Zenga meditates in a soliloquy whether first nature or long want of peace has wrought my mind to this, I cannot tell. But horrors now are not displeasing to me. There's the sound of thunder. I like this rocking of the battlements. Rage on, ye winds, burst, clouds and waters roar. You bear a just resemblance of my fortune and suit the gloomy habit of my soul. So here we can see not an attachment immediately of insanity, right, or derangement to a Moorish characters. There's actually a sense that the conditions have deranged him, right? And I'm thinking here with Lamar Jarrell Bruce, of course, and thinking about how the conditions of slavery are actually quite deranging to the mind, right? So there's a kind of irrationality to this madness. There's a sense of great historicity that Zenga is imparting, or Young is imparting to the character of Zenga with opening the play in this way with a soliloquy that's so is thoughtful about the actual situations that has led to the character of Zenga and his characterization. This soliloquy is also performed by Ira Aldridge in 1848 in a series of London productions. This production doesn't, however, stay discreetly within England. It also travels in newspapers back to the United States, where it becomes looped into debates about slavery and abolition. Aldridge is also, as these newspapers point out, actually his origin is from the United States, right? So they're kind of thinking too particularly about what it means to have this African-American present as Zenga. So one of the reviews points out his delineation of the proud, revengeful Moor was finely conceived in the soliloquies and those passages in which the reflective powers of the mind are at work. While the material action is suspended, he possesses the rare faculty of completely abstracting and separating himself from all external objects, or of only receiving impressions from those that harmonize with the state of his mind. Zenga's opening soliloquy in the first act, During the Storm, expresses this mental condition very forcibly, and that is a review of Ira Aldridge's performance. So thinking particularly about how his performance of the soliloquy is able to actually stop time, right? It suspends the action of the play in a way that highlights his great reflectiveness and his ability to actually think about what's happening. So I wanted to look particularly, I think this was the poster for the show. It's actually, Jessica, if we could put up the slide, that would be great. Thank you. This image on the left is Ira Aldridge stepping on the prostrate Alonzo. I think Cornesha was reading this scene earlier. And you can see this is the last part. So he's kind of unleashing this intensity, making really clear the scene of recognition in which he is the avenger. But this only occurs towards the end of the play, right? And through much of the play itself, Zenga is very much performing this virtuosic role, right, of showing his resentment, but also performing this outward friendliness. So we can actually see in the other image, this is an engraving from Act 4, Scene 1. Oh, I should also say the image on the left is at Northwestern, part of their special collections for Ira Aldridge. But the image on the right is earlier in the play, where you can see Zenga here kind of clenching a fist. He's looking sideways at Don Alonzo, who has his head in his hands in despair. So we can actually, again, here see Zenga as a seer, right? In this moment where Don Alonzo is quite unseeing of this entire situation. He's really wrapped up in his own feelings, in much the way that Lisa was talking about earlier, being so absorbed in his own situation that he cannot see anything else. He cannot see this plan for revenge being actually worked out. Actually, we can return back to, thank you. So I'm really interested in thinking about how this Moorish character early on holds on to introspection and holds on to this rich interiority beyond the spectacular, right? Beyond something that's much more spectacularly resistant. And I'm trying to think about, I'm trying to think beyond resistance in a way and think about the radicalness of minor feelings, right? Envy, of revenge, of resentment, and also argue that these are just as powerful as something that is very blatantly out there, very blatantly resistant. So I'm really interested in thinking about the rich interiority that this role affords, and I'm really interested in looking at how Red Bull works with this role. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. We're all looking forward to that. Bridget.
Kia ora, everyone. It's great to be here for a discussion of the revenge. And as someone who spent a lot of time with heroic tragedies, it's a great pleasure for me to actually find a bunch of other people who also see them as compelling. So the issue that I'm going to focus on is why Young, who was a deeply conformist, ambitious, pious man of letters, who just had a very big success with a very conventional play, a very conventional heroic play, came to write an extraordinary text like The Revenge. And, you know, it's worth bearing in mind, it was just in 1719 that Young produced Busiris, which is, it's an Oriental heroic play, which is a genre, of course, that is intimately connected with colonialism. You know, Dryden describes the heroic play as epic in parvo. It is, like the epic, it is a deeply imperial form. So it may at points seem a little sleepy, as Lisa is suggesting, although I think there are lots of fiery moments of you know, real aggression and tension in heroic plays. But it certainly is a colonial form. But Busiris is not in any way a striking text like The Revenge, and it sinks pretty much without trace in the course of the 18th century. So 2 years later, Young writes The Revenge. And why? You know, so I think the answer is a very simple one: the South Sea bubble. So the bursting of the South Sea bubble, which occurs in 1720 to 1721, is regarded by economic historians as the first great crisis of British capitalism. You might even say it's the first great crisis of capital per se. It's an event that is comparable to the crash of 1929 that led to the Depression, or more recently to the banking crisis of 2008. It's a huge event in British society, in British politics, and in British culture. So how does it connect with the play? Well, until only a few years ago, economic historians thought of the bubble as an example of what I remember a head of the Fed called irrational exuberance in the stock market. It was as though British investors were gambling. They were engaging in a giant Ponzi scheme. And when the crash came, it was regarded as a kind of moral lesson about the dangers of financial investment, modern financial investment. But what nobody paid attention to until an economic historian called Helen Paul looked at the bubble again was the fact that the South Sea Company, which was at the heart of the crash, was set up in the wake of the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, which brought an end to the War of the Spanish Succession. And in the Treaty of Utrecht, the Tory government who negotiated that agreement got the right to trade enslaved people into Spanish colonies in the New World. This was called the asiento, and this was seen as potentially an enormous money spinner. So what happened in 1720, 1721 was the collapse of a company whose primary purpose was the slave trade. They hired their workforce from the Royal Navy and from the Royal Africa Company, and they traded at least 65,000 people into the New World. Now, for centuries, as Cornesha certainly will be very aware, the British relied on the black legend of Spanish conquest in America to try and differentiate their own colonial activities, to gloss over their own colonial activities. And heroic plays as a genre had an important role to play in that project. You know, you just need to look at the Indian Queen and, of course, the Indian Emperor and the many reiterations of those texts. But by acquiring the asiento, the British might be seen to be supping at the poison chalice of Spanish cruelty and exploitation in the New World. Certainly, there were commentators like Addison who were very hostile to the extractive activities associated with New World colonization. So, I think that Edward Young, looking around at the moral and material devastation caused by the bursting of the South Sea bubble, might have had reason to think that there were catastrophic consequences of enslaving people, that those catastrophic consequences felt by the person enslaved, but also by the slaveholder. So there's a way in which I think the revenge is suggesting, in the immediate context of the bursting of the bubble, that engaging in wide-scale slave trading could be potentially disastrous. Now, another significant aspect of the play, and this speaks to some of the things that Amy, I think, was saying about Zanger's extraordinary sense of himself as a kind of, well, I think of him as a theatre director, in fact, you know, managing the action of the play, is that he persistently regrets, of course, and this speaks to the heroic dimension of it, he regrets the fact he has to pursue his revenge in an underhand way that offends his sense of his honor as a prince. For him, one of the most humbling aspects of his enslaved status is that he has to dissimulate, he has to hide, he has to scheme. He's acting quietly behind the scenes a lot of the time. Now, in showing Zanger forced into dishonorable dissimulation, I think Young is commenting not only on the kind of dishonoring effects of enslavement, but on the broader corruption of the British establishment, Walpole's government in particular, that was hell-bent on covering up the effects of the South Sea bubble. In 1721, Walpole becomes known as the Screen Master General. He is the man of disguise and misdirection incarnate. And the corruption that he was disguising, I think, leads all the way back to the asiento, to the insistence of the British that they acquire the right to expand their share of the transatlantic trade in slaves. So there is this way in which this play is reflecting through Zenga not just on the situation of a prince enslaved, but on its own culture of production and the way that they have, if you like, brought themselves into shame and dishonor.
Fascinating. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you all so much. Bridget, I'll just ask you to mute. Thank you. So we have an opportunity to take questions and comments from our live audience. Please feel free to type these into the comments section. I promise we won't put you on camera. That's not a capability of this particular platform. Instead, we'll be able to curate from the comments and questions that are posted and use those as a basis for further discussion. I wanted to get us started by talking about something that is the major cog in the plot that Zenga sets in motion, but also why he sets this in motion. As none of you mentioned this, that he describes in that first scene to his confidant, Isabella, his lover, Isabella, that years before the action of the play, he experienced a grave moment of injury. And it consisted of this man, Alonso, who became his enslaver, who had killed his father and brought him to Iberia. At one moment, this man who is supposedly performing friendship and a kind of peer relationship slaps Zenga on the face. And to Alonso, this is nothing, but to Zenga, this is everything. This is this action of casual brutality that belies all other pretense and performatives. And I want to ask you to think about that in relation to the female characters of the play, and particularly the young woman who is set up as, by Zenga as the instrument for revenge upon Alonso. And that's Leonora. And her self-description at a moment of crisis in the fourth act, where she describes that a woman who loves, she says, the maid that loves goes out to sea upon a shattered plank and puts her trust in miracles for safety. So just as she is this instrument of Zanga's machinations, and he calls into question her honor. He calls into question her fidelity to Alonso, and this potentially destroys her, not just her reputation, but ultimately she takes, spoiler alert, she takes her own life. But she's shipwrecked. And as we think about the ways that this play sets up a kind of global commerce and an awareness, as you've highlighted so well, of the way that genre works in relation to contemporary events and major forces in the economy and major crises that result from globalizing capitalism, we see this woman, this high-born, white, Christian, Spanish woman who is not just metaphorically, but quite literally caught between these forces. I'm just wondering how that factor might influence some of your very carefully wrought, fascinating readings. Would anyone like to take that up? This is the what about the women question. Lisa?
Well, I'll maybe take a stab at it. I don't know how far I'll get with it, but there are two women in the play, right? There's Isabella and there's Leonora. And I'll get back to Leonora, but the one thing I did want to say about Isabella, right, is that and Tracy, you just said this, right? Isabella is Zanga's lover, and what's interesting, again, if we think about racialization, right, is that there's actually no intimation in the play about a fear of miscegenation in the play. Not that what the audience might have seen and experienced in any given period is different, but it's not spectacularized in the way that Othello and Desdemona are. And so that's something really, really interesting about the play. Leonora, is in some ways like Zanga, Tracy. I think maybe this is what you're trying to get to, right? She is pure honor. And the reason she, again, spoiler alert, ends up stabbing herself, right, is that she believes, in the same, it's actually a weird analogy to the letter about what you know and how you know it and how you perform it, that her belief that she would have to defend herself for having, another spoiler alert, I guess, having had premarital relations, right, with Alonso's supposed best friend, right, that she can't even bear to defend herself. It's too much. That's a slap, right, to her sense of her own virtue, right? And the outlet for her, I mean, what's different about her is that the way she exhibits agency, right, is very different. She turns internally, right, and she inflicts the harm upon herself. And Zanga experiences that harm, right, and turns outward. And I think that's a very gendered, right, that's a very gendered situation, the relationship to honor and honorable action. And what is honorable action for a male figure or a female figure is very different. And so I think there's that sense of it, right, in the play. And she is more honorable, of course, than Don Carlos or Don Alonso, who betray one another because of jealousy over Leonora. So again, she's an interesting figure to look at in relationship to Zanga and gender and agency. How does a female enact agency? Well, she takes control of her body entirely. So
she takes it out of a moral system and out of an economic system and out of all of the male characters' machinations. Yeah, it's just that in such a tightly wrought play with seven characters. This is not a sprawling masterpiece with multiple plots going on. It's a single plot play. Every character's positioning and every character's place in the action matters intricately. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought we might also talk about the moral dimension, which underlines all of your discussions. And I'm thinking about this in relation to the epilogue, which is an invocation to the husbands in the audience to differentiate themselves from the play. Would anybody be interested in taking that up?
Well, the epilogue is raunchy. It's a very raunchy epilogue, which I think, Bridget could speak to even better than I could, right? The way in which you often have that kind of, after a very dark tragedy, a very kind of playful, eroticized lightning. And it is, I think, completely at odds with the values that the play itself projects. It's actually kind of startling to read the epilogue, and it's not always included, right, in subsequent editions. And so it's an interesting moment when the prologue and the epilogue are stripped from various editions because they wouldn't play. One reason would be that they wouldn't play anymore to audiences as this play traveled across the 18th and into the 19th century. But it's a very disturbing, very misogynist epilogue, to say the least.
So I see that we have some terrific questions being posted in the comment section, and I'm going to try to invoke my option here to queue up Misty Anderson's question, and maybe Jessica can help us in the background. Here we go. Cornesha, this is directed to you. Misty would love to hear you comment on the 100 thrones that Zanga celebrates and the plural idea of nation within Africa that it suggests. So do you see this aligning with Bridget's argument? Is there a connection here with the South Sea Company?
So I just want to clarify with Misty. I don't know if Misty can. The 100 thrones, or anybody can clarify for me before I comment on that.
I suspect Misty is rapidly typing in the background. Does this have resonance for anyone else?
Yeah, I think it was maybe Cornesha in the line that you were reading. There was Zanga's reference. I think that was the line to 100. I think that was where Misty is picking that up. Yeah, it's what let Africa and her 100 thrones rejoice. So I think that was the line that you were reading from that Misty's picking up on. So that's the context. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Yes. So that's it. Well, first of all, I'm gonna say that's a really good question, and thank you for being so attentive to the quote that I utilized. In particular, with the 100 thrones that Zanga celebrates. I mean, when we think about Africa as a continent itself, there's no way to, in particular, describe it, even with the different sections. I believe within a European perspective, it gets it most times it's minimized as just either sometimes North Africa or the land of the Blacks, which is usually the western part of Africa. And then, of course, when we think about the eastern part of Africa, it usually is referenced as more noble, with more noble blood, because it usually talks about Carthage, right? This more northern, eastern Africa, which is, of course, is commented throughout as well, the play. But so when we think about 100 thrones and this form of the idea of nation really comes about, as I mentioned in my remarks, really comes about really towards the 16th, 17th century. And so it really isn't a thing at the time, but we see this formation of a nation coming about as Spain, of course, comes in with their Iberian Union with Portugal. And so when we think about nation, yeah, I think that it could definitely suggest this plural idea of what nation is. But I think nation comes about within a European perspective when we look at the Iberian and medieval setting that Huang is referring to in the text. And then, of course, with the South, I think going now to the South Sea Corporation, I think that's with Bridget's argument. I don't know if Bridget wanted to add on to that.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about a polarity to deal with, because processes of colonization are, all about extraction and the most brutal forms of, economic domination. But the forms, the genres that British culture has inherited in which to kind of process this in literary terms are, of course, heroic ones. And so there is, there's a kind of the 100 Thrones is exemplary of the idea of empire, nation as something noble, and the idea of the creation of empire as something honorable. But the South Sea Company is the kind of, dirty underside of the carpet that often is going to, I think it happens in other heroic plays as well, like The Indian Emperor, what Dryden called, the fire of history emerges in plays and starts tearing at their decorum. And so I think that the revenge, the kind of generic mélange that Lisa was talking about, is a kind of demonstration of how those two things, those two poles, you know, the kind of the majesty of the 100 Thrones of Africa and the kind of brutal exploitation of the South Sea Company are being processed in this text.
It's always salutary to see in works from the 18th century how the very constitution of empire building and imperialistic system is being questioned as it's being constructed. And here's a great example of it. I want to see if I can fit in a couple more questions. The first from Jesse Rosenberg. And Jesse's pointing us to the differences that exist around the understanding of the term Moor, sometimes being indicative of a member of a Muslim community, such as that which dominated medieval Spain, other times a more general way for referring to somebody who is from Africa. Would any of you like to take up this quite broad topic in more specific terms?
Yes, I can. So thank you so much, Jesse, for this question / comment. So yeah, the term quote Moor, end quote, I'm not going to use the term in particular only because in contemporary usage, this is actually a slur. But what I can offer is that, yes, this is a very ambiguous term. And for my reasoning for not using the term is for that very reason, because it's very ambiguous. In the work that I do in particular, this term can mean Blacka, quote, Moor, end quote, as we see, of course, within the English context, whereas in the Spanish context, we see it as well, but it is extremely ambiguous. It does not indicate what type of person is actually represented on stage. Usually that term usually means othered or an abject person, which, as I mentioned in my remarks, is the opposite of the European subject. So this person can represent much. It can represent a Black African, it can represent a North African, it can represent a person of Muslim descent, as we see here. And also, I've seen this term actually also grouped into also representing people of Jewish faith. And so, especially in the particular context of Spain and Portugal and the Iberia, this is a very, very difficult term to describe and also specify when we're thinking about a character that is called as such. But I think Barbara Fuchs' work on this brings in more specificity in order to describe, quote, Moorishness, end quote, with regard to Spanishness within the Iberian Peninsula. But I hope that was a way to kind of help specify a bit more the usage of the term and the ambiguity surrounding it.
Maybe just add a little bit there to say that, you know, over the course of the 17th and 18th century, picking up on what Cornesha was saying, you could see these arguments in the criticism, particularly referring to say Othello. How Black is he, right? Under the category of the Moor, and I think the best way to read that, right, is to think about how troubled, complicated, and even as they were consolidating the category of Blackness and race, you can read those debates about the exact color or complexion of Othello as indicative of a deep discomfort and a kind of racism, to be blunt, right? That it is, you know, that there may be discomfort, and yet the category, those very debates are like as if, you know, it's going to matter if he's tawny or dark Black, are indicative of the concern about the consolidation of race as a category. Again, it's an interesting thing. We could talk about it for many hours, but it comes out of the sort of long medieval and early modern history in the Iberian Peninsula that Cornesha is much more familiar with than me, and is very, very eloquent about. But that you could just trace all of this forward through the period.
So taking what I think will be our final question from Christina Straub. Christina is asking us to connect the historical work that you've all been so brilliantly highlighting for us and thinking ahead in time to our context and the question of reparations in US culture. I'm wondering particularly if Amy might be willing to take this up because it also speaks to what we might do with and how we might think with the revenge being produced in the 2020s.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I think that the revenge, the original production actually is already thinking about reparation, right? Because as Tracy was pointing out, it's really also holding on to microaggressions, right? The idea of the slap, it's remembering it against this kind of imperial amnesia that the other characters are kind of playing into. Zenga at one point says, "This is vengeance worth waking the dead for," right? So that he is bringing back this assault on his own body and relating it to a larger assault against the country, right? So he's really trying to think about ways forward that also not only think about him as an individual, but think about a larger situation, the larger wrongs for the country. I was actually thinking about this with early on Leonora. The prologue actually is really ambivalent too about the relationship between Leonora and Zenga, because it says it's almost like we wish virtue's self to bleed because there's a greater wrong done to Zenga's bleeding country, right? So that they're competing, and the prologue is actually trying to guard against that type of reading where we would forget about Leonora's wrongs. But it's not doing a very good job, right? It finds Zenga's predicament so much more fascinating and so much more compelling. So I think that I would just be willing to, I would just want to amplify that reparative move that the play is already moving towards. Yeah, thank you so much for this question.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Amy. I want to just give our panelists an opportunity to connect across the lines here to see if there's anything that you heard from each other that you just like to pick up and make sure our audiences bear in mind when they're watching the play.
I'm curious to see how the audience responds on the next Monday. I really want to see how they respond to Zenga. So I don't want to anticipate anything beyond the pure delight of seeing actors once again perform the parts.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Bridget Orr, Amy Huang, Lisa Freeman, and Cornesha Tweede. I trust that we have whet our audience's appetite to see this play, and I very, very much look forward to that experience myself. Thank you, and good night.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for this fascinating conversation. As a reminder, this seminar will be available on Red Bull Theater's YouTube and Facebook pages as soon as we sign off here. So feel free to revisit and share. I am now even myself more excited about this performance on January 22nd. And hang on one second. Sorry. Sorry, I'm now even more excited to see this reading of Edward Young's The Revenge this coming Monday, and we hope you will all join us for this and for our upcoming programming, which I'll just mention very quickly. Following The Revenge on January 22nd, we will be presenting a frankly hilarious new adaptation of Moliere's final play, The Imaginary Invalid, starring Mark Lynn Baker on February 19th. We'll also be streaming online in partnership with FIAF, the French Alliance Alliance Francaise. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra follows that with Audra McDonald and John Douglas Thompson on March 25th. Tickets to both of these events are now available at redbulltheater.com. We are incredibly proud and excited also to announce our 20th anniversary festival, which will take place later this year between April 15th and May 13th, featuring workshops and readings of work at the core of our mission. We have an incredible variety of work planned, both classical and in conversation with the classics, featuring artists including Santino Fontana, Rebecca Hall, Patrick Page, Reeve Carney, and more. Tickets to this in-person only festival will be made available in February, so check your email. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not mention that all the work that we do here at Red Bull Theater on stage, online, in conversation with scholars, or in classrooms cannot happen without the support of donors. So if you believe in the unique work Red Bull Theater is doing, we hope you will consider becoming a friend of Red Bull Theater with a donation of as little as $50, which will give you exclusive early access to tickets, discounts, and more. So with that, thank you so much for joining us this evening for a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Tracy. I will be at the theater this coming Monday, and I look forward to meeting you there. Thank you so much.